Hello, this is Richard, the Fear Merchant, host of the Bizarre Cast, and you are listening to The Monster Guys.
Hi, I'm Icy Sedgwick, and you're listening to the Monster Guys podcast.
Hey, this is Matthew Meyer from yokai.com, and you're listening to the Monster Guys podcast.
Welcome to the Monster Guys podcast, Halloween in July edition. We have some very special treats and perhaps some tricks in store for you tonight. Now please remove your heads and your arms. Oops, I mean your hats and your coats and your shawls and leave them on the rack. Now please be so kind as to join us in the dead center of the ballroom. Pay no mind to her, she simply lost her head. Now watch your step around these little fellas. They're simply here to trip you up. You do have some goodies for our trick-or-treaters, don't you? You wouldn't want to upset them, now would you?
Michael, be careful. Watch your step here.
Where is this? Where are we?
Watch out. Oh my gosh, Michael, watch out. Look.
What do you see? What is it?
I spy with my little eye. It's Halloween in July.
Hello and welcome to the Monster Guys podcast. This is week 4 of our Halloween in July episodes. I am DC McGannon. As always, I'm joined by my partner and co-conspirator in all things creative, C. Michael McGannon.
I'm kind of sad it's the last week of this. I guess we get to look forward to Halloween later on in the year too, but this was an exciting series so far.
Absolutely. We've had a lot of fun this week. We've talked to some very cool people, kind of reminisced about a lot of cool things Halloween. And it's true, we only have a couple more months to go until we get to celebrate all the festivities surrounding Halloween and that season, and I can't wait for that to happen. If for no other reason, it's going to be cooler air.
Which was half of the idea behind this series of episodes.
Yeah, just to give us an opportunity to mentally refresh and enjoy a little bit of something that we all, I think, enjoy. A celebration of Halloween and all that entails. We've had some great topics this month. We've talked about scarecrows. We've talked about the masks we wear. And last week, we talked about jack-o'-lanterns, Will-O-The-Wisps, and other foolish fire. I've had a lot of great response, and tonight is going to be a special topic all to itself, the spirit veil, or the thinning of the veil, so to speak. We're going to dive deep into that topic, and we have 3 guests to share in that conversation with us this week. But before we introduce our guests, let me say that this episode is sponsored by you, the listener. We just want to say thanks to you for hanging out with us here on the Monster Guys podcast week in and week out. We've been growing steadily over the past couple of years, and we really appreciate it. It means a lot that you give us a listen and that you respond to our conversations. You hang out with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You send us cool messages. It's a very cool thing to happen each and every week. And so we want to dedicate this episode to you and say thanks, and that we really appreciate you being with us, and we look forward to even greater fun times ahead.
Definitely.
Michael, as I mentioned a moment ago, our topic tonight is the spirit veil. Indeed, I have a few spirits with me here tonight to help along with the conversation.
Some golden spirits.
I won't say what spirits they are, but they will certainly be helping us, I think, along the way. But we also have...
the traditional Irish muse.
That's right. But we also have 3 guests with us tonight. Of course, Richard Martin, the Fear Merchant, is back with us again. He's been hanging out with us all month, and had a lot of fun talking to him each week. So thanks to Richard for being with us, and he'll be back with us talking to us a little bit from the Irish perspective of the thinning of the veil. We also have Icy Sedgwick, who is with us during week 2 of Halloween in July when we had the topic of masks, and she brought quite an academic perspective to that topic, and it's always a pleasure speaking with her. Very intelligent, and at the same time very fun to speak with and to listen to and hear what she's got to say on various topics. This week we add yet a 3rd guest, and this is a guest that was with us, I think, February of 2015, way back when we did a series of episodes on yokai, Japanese monsters, or Japanese spirits and Japanese ghosts, the yurei, and a number of topics with regards to Japanese culture. Matthew Meyer, who is an author, yokai expert, a yokai illustrator. You can find a lot about his work over at yokai.com. That's just a starting place, because the man is prolific when it comes to Japanese culture and yokai specifically.
You took that word right out of my brain. I'm really excited to have him back as well. I'm excited to have everybody back, but it's been a while since we've spoken with Matthew, and I look forward to his different angle on this topic.
Every time I talk to Matthew, I come out feeling smarter.
Yeah.
You know, so it's just that type of guy, and he brings us a unique perspective from a very different part of the world on a topic that's not probably often discussed in connection to Japanese culture. You know, of course, Halloween is a very Western celebration, but there's a lot of correlation and there's a lot of similarities, and Matthew's going to share a little bit from that perspective. So with Richard and Icy and Matthew all hanging out with us tonight.
To the Wizard of Oz we go?
To the Wizard, I guess, down that yellow brick road. I don't know. With spirits in tow, we shall speak of the spirit veil and the thinning of that veil. As we jump into that, let me share another private message that was sent to us this week, and this has connection to our topic, but it was very cool to hear from a woman, matter of fact, on the other side of the pond. Again, it was a private message, so I don't want to say full names here, because I'm not sure if she'd want all that revealed, but she says, "Hi, DC and Michael, just wanted to reach out and say hello, and to also let you both know that I'm loving Halloween in July." And we've received a number of messages like this over the month, that people have really enjoyed this series of topics. We're glad for that. It's been a lot of fun for us. It's been a change of pace. She goes on to say, you know, thank you both for all of your hard work and putting on a cool show. You even give Irish names and place names a go. And I say that because in response to us announcing that we're going to talk about this spirit veil, or the thinning of the veil, she just so happens to live about an hour away from a very special place in Ireland. And I'm going to give that Irish name a go again, and I hope it does some justice. But she talks to me in this message about the Rath Cruachan, and I hope I say that right. It's not spelled that way, but I'm trying to give kind of the maybe the westernized version or the anglicized version of that.
We'll go with it.
Okay. So anyway, it's a place that in Ireland is apparently regarded as a very thin place spiritually. You've done a little bit of looking into this since we've gotten this message, I actually don't know a lot about this place, but it really has my attention with what she has shared with us so far. And she talks about this being a place that is very much associated with Halloween, and a little bit that I have read on it in the past week indicates that it could be the beginning place of Halloween, because it's considered to be like the Irish gate of hell, or a portal to the other world at this place. There's a cave there and a series of mounds and all kinds of things going on there, and it's considered to be the home of the Morrigan. Of course, we know from pre-Christian era Ireland that she was considered to be the goddess of that Celtic region, and this is kind of believed by many to be, from what I understand so far, to be kind of her seat, the seat of the ancient royal site of Queen Maeve. And so there's a lot going on there, and it's considered to be a place where the veil is very thin in that country. It has quite a bit of history. It's believed each year during Samhain that the Morrigan emerges from this cave that exists there, takes part in a ritual. And again, I don't have all the details of this. I'm actually very excited to learn more about this. And she has shared that she's going to send some photographs and some notes about this. Maybe we can even get an article or something about it, because it is very fascinating what she has shared with us, just the little she's shared with us so far. But she said basically when we announced that, it inspired her to go ahead and take a trip, go out and see it, put some notes together, take some photographs, and visit this place that's supposed to be very thin, which many consider a portal or the gate of hell in Ireland, or the gate to the other world. So very, very cool thing going on there. And you actually have a connection there with something else, with what you've read.
Yeah, a little bit. And I want to throw out this word as well because I read this used, and I've always loved the word hellmouth, but it's considered by some to be the Irish hellmouth.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it has a very epic sound to it.
Yeah, it does.
But yeah, so the whole connection of the Morrigan to Samhain, I kind of forgot. It makes perfect sense, of course, with her being a goddess of battle and death, and to some, just epitomizing that darkness of the year. But she and Dagda, the god of fertility and magic, a druid of sorts, those two actually got together at some point, and the interpretation of what exactly went down between them varies from person to person, from story to story, but we do know that it ended up, it was their battle plan against the Fomorians, between the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorian battle over Ireland, I guess you could say. But it's kind of an interesting metaphor for the topic we're talking about tonight. You have the goddess of darkness and the god of light. Mm-hmm. He's not necessarily the god of light, but kind of that same black and white dichotomy that you see. It's almost like the role of King Oberon and Queen Titania reversed. But for tonight's topic, as a god of life and a goddess of death, there's a thinning between their own veil where life and death meet at this time of year. And I think it's pretty poetic and pretty cool.
It is, and it's funny that you talk about the god of light and the god of death, because there are those who talk about the thinning of the veil as sunrise and sunset. Let's take it to a kind of a cosmic place, if you will. This whole topic, a lot of times we tend to narrow it to that time of year of Halloween, and we talk about the thinning of the veil, when the dead walk among us, and all of that. But there are those who believe and who will tell you that it's not just necessarily one time of the year, but possibly every single day this thinning of the veil takes place. There are stronger times during the year when it takes place. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, and especially with Matthew Meyer, but people who talk about places as being a thinner place among the spirit world. But if you would think about the sunrise and the sunset, a lot of people describe this phenomenon as a thinning of that spiritual realm, or not necessarily a thinning, but when the physical world and the spiritual world are closest together. If you think about the sun resting on the horizon during that sunrise or sunset, there's a sense of peace and awe and wonder. I don't know if and I'm speaking to listeners here, but I don't know if you've ever found yourself walking on a beach or just sitting out in the backyard watching the sunrise, or just standing at a window with a cup of coffee to watch the sunrise or the sunset. I'm completely mesmerized by sunrises and sunsets. I remember us and myself many times throughout my life taking walks on the beach at sunrise and at sunset, or seeking those times out, because for me, there's a great time of peace and rest that seems to overcome me during those times. It's kind of like the time of full moon every month. I love to just go sit out under the full moon. But this sunrise and sunset, it's like there's a place where the spiritual and the physical are meeting and just kind of rest with one another. And that's considered to be a thinning of the veil, or a thinning of that spirit realm, or a closeness of that spirit realm, because the sun representing life and energy and birth and all that, and the sunset and the night sky coming in representing sleep or rest or even death. To some people, there's a closeness in association and in consciousness about what all that means. And there's a reason why we slow down and pay attention to some of those moments. And I believe it's because we feel closer, or realize that there's something else going on there that we need to tune into. And a lot of people would tell you that's the thinning of the veil. And it doesn't just take place at one time a year, but it takes place every single day. Let's take a little bit further. You could consider a time of meditation, or a time of playing music. I know people who it's just like they go into a different world when they play music, or they paint on a canvas, or they draw, or they read. What moment exists for you where you are at total peace and rest and relaxation? That's a thinning of the veil. It's like there's a closeness to who we really are. It's where we slow down and realize what's really important. And that, for many people, is that spiritual closeness, or that thinning of that spiritual veil. I've heard some people teach it like this, that, in our modern world, we tend to think of all the stuff that's going on around us, the mayhem of the day, the traffic, the lights, the sounds, the advertisements, the TV, the video games. We could go on and on and on. That's an outer world. And then we kind of believe that there's an inner world that's separate, but really, many believe, and even myself, that the inner world and outer world are not separate. There's a connection there. And I believe that the veil, so to speak, falls down the quieter we get, and the more we realize that inner world and that outer world are touching one another and becoming closer. And whether it's in a time of meditation, or writing a song, or painting, even people in their work, in their profession, there are people I know that get into this zone where they just feel at peace. And, what's that moment for you? What's that moment for any one of us where we understand that the internal and the outer are the same, and they need to connect, and they begin to draw closer to one another? And I believe it's in that moment, and it can be any moment, day or night. It could be any time of year, but I believe in that moment, the veil begins to disappear. We realize something at a much higher level is going on. So this is getting pretty deep already.
I was going to say.
So I'm going to back out of this, but there you go. We're talking about Halloween here, trick-or-treating, masks, and goblins, right?
I was going to say, about halfway through that mythology would kind of back you up.
I told you that the spirits are guiding me here.
The idea that, the sun is a guy in a chariot pulling the light across the sky. But then taking it further, even into the latter part of what you're saying, you could even see that reflected, that idea spiritually reflected in stories like Vasilisa and Baba Yaga. Which is one
definitely.
of our favorite stories.
Mm-hmm.
So in that story, you see Vasilisa come across the 3 different riders, the red, the black, and I believe the gray, that represent the different times of day. And it's after she meets all 3 of them, and after they pass, that she gets to Baba Yaga's hut.
Yeah.
So you could say in that same way, kind of what you're talking about as well. I mean, it's after that day has passed and when it becomes quiet, when you get to the deeper part of the woods, that you find the inner struggle or the inner quest that you're trying to go on.
Yeah.
So in all deepness.
Yeah. Well, and you say the deeper part of the woods. That's another interesting conversation. And we talk a little bit with Matthew about this in our conversation later on, but people believe that there's a thinning of the veil or a heightened awareness, so to speak, in places like the edge of the woods, between a wooded area and an open field. There are some who would tell you, actually, if you go into the woods, the deeper you go, and you might find these small clearings, that those small clearings are actually very heightened places of magic and awareness and consciousness, where the ocean meets the land, where you can look at the horizon and see the sky meeting the ocean, where the mountain meets the valley. You go to these
places.
Huh?
The liminal places.
Yeah, the liminal places. These places, are prevalent throughout our literature and our consciousness and our storytelling. And people will tell you in various cultures that that's where you go to meet the other side. And that's where the activity is at its highest, in the spirit realm. Now, talking about Halloween, we talk about this time of year, especially from the Celtic tradition of Samhain, that time of year is a thinning of the veil. It's a thinning of that spiritual block. I want to take you to the concept of autumn. October obviously is in autumn. What's another word that we use for autumn?
Fall.
The fall. There's a reason why. It's a falling away. And I go through this process every single year. It's a time of reflection, a time of introspection. But you think about fall, it's a time to allow that which no longer needs to be to fall away. You're getting ready to enter a season of death, winter, and then rebirth. But before all that happens, you have to let stuff fall away that doesn't need to be there anymore. That is an awareness and an attuneness to allow that spiritual side of things to break through, so to speak, or that veil to fall away. During this time of year, especially from that Celtic tradition of Samhain, it's believed that this is a time of magic and reverence and a very special time for ritual, and when the dead can and do walk among us. Take that to other cultures. The Day of the Dead from Mexican heritage, it falls right after Halloween, but similar. There's a great reverence and honoring of ancestors and, a place and a time where we feel that we are closer to that side, and that side is closer to us and even, so to speak, reaching across the line. In older times, people would even set an extra place at the dinner table, believing that the spirits of the dead would join them for a meal because they were that close. And there was an expectation to be able to commune with them, to speak with them, or at least to hear from them in, if not a physical way, a spiritual way, an inner voice, or at least a sense that, hey, I'm here watching over you. So there is a lot going on during that time of year, and I think we should be well to remember that it's not necessarily during that time of year. It could be any day, at any hour, where that becomes very real for people. This is also a time of the year because the veil, that energy or that psychic barrier is lower, where we see practices and rituals and traditions of divination becoming heightened, or people becoming much more aware and seeking that kind of thing out. Whether it's a tarot reading or seeking psychic, or divining of any sort, looking into the crystal balls, watching the fire and seeing what shapes come out of the flames.
The original version of Bloody Mary.
Yeah, there's a reason why during this time of year people seek that kind of stuff out more than other times of the year, because I believe there's an awareness and there's a sense that this time of year I can reach, I can cross, I can pierce through that side a little easier and maybe find something that I'm looking for. I don't know that people actually find what they're looking for. A lot of times they don't get the answer they want and they have to figure that out. But the fact is that this is a very real experience, and as such, a lot of practices and rituals and traditions surround it this time of year. This spirit veil, or the thinning of, or the falling away of that veil. So again, I'm getting pretty deep. It's early in the podcast. We have some people to talk to. Let's lighten it up a little bit. Halloween in July. It's a fun time. I'm very much looking forward to Halloween this year, just like every year. And I know a lot of, you know what? This past week is when I've started to see retailers put Halloween out.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I'm starting to see preview of product online from retailers.
There's now a running countdown. I think we're 100 days in or 101 days in, something like that. But there's a running countdown where you can go to some website that's basically counting down to Halloween.
Yeah, I think it's actually called Halloween Countdown or something. I actually follow it on Twitter, and every once in a while I get the pop-up, you're 100 days away, you're 50 days away, and closer I get, you get more of those notifications, but
yeah.
It's kind of fun to see.
Oh, yeah.
So right now, let's swim across the ocean.
Let's not and say we did.
Okay, and go speak with Richard Martin, the Fear Merchant again. Well, here we are in our fourth and final week of Halloween in July, Michael, and it's been a good one. We've got Richard Martin, the Fear Merchant, is back with us again. In addition to our other guest for this episode, a very special episode about the spirit veil, what I call the spirit veil. People refer to it as the thinning of the veil, or that time, kind of like the witching hour or the midnight hour, and the time around Halloween when the spirit world and the human world kind of merge or overlap. Richard, in Ireland, fairies appear in folklore everywhere. You can't get away from them. The woods, water, mountainsides, even the cellar of your home, even in babies' cribs, you find fairies. Is there anywhere that's really safe from fairies in Ireland, Richard?
There isn't, and in this modern age, fairies still have a really real and tangible effect on everyone. Now, I've mentioned that I am a city critter. I'm not a country bumpkin. And my lovely girlfriend, Maeve, lovely Irish name there, she has grown up in the countryside, and she has said to me that she has known of people who have not built houses on fairy forts or fairy rings, and people who have built their houses on fairy rings or fairy forts have had a lot of bad luck, and it seems to carry over, whether that's something superstitious or whether you're manifesting your own destiny with regards that it is something that's very real in Irish culture to date, and there is fairy rings and fairy forts. So people that maybe don't know what those are, there could be a ring of clover or mushrooms or something to that effect, where there's a ring of things, whether that's explained away with biology or ecology. People are still very superstitious of that, and it does have a bearing on reality, which I suppose is what we all live in, and it is fairly spooky.
Yeah, and even bigger structures such as hillsides or mountains a lot of times would be considered burial mounds. And where that's relevant to our conversation today is a lot of people believe by stepping on or building on or crossing over those structures or those plants or those areas in the forest or what have you, you're actually crossing the spirit world. You're stepping on their territory. You're crossing over into their land. And there are certain times of the year and certain holiday celebrations where that veil, if you will, thins out quite a bit. So it's very easy for one, the human or the fairy world or the spirit world, to cross over into the other quite easily. Michael, what else can you tell us about fairies and fairy mounds and the spirit world with regards to the veil?
Well, I mean, while we're talking about getting into their territory, that's very dangerous. And that's kind of why we ask, is there anywhere that is actually safe? Because even fairies that you're friendly to or kind or, just amicable with, they can turn on you fairly quickly. There's stories of like the Cluricon that will take care of your wine cellar. If you mistreat him, he'll go and destroy all of your wine and your beer.
Not the wine.
Richard, you need to be very careful with the Clericon. It's a very real spirit, and he protects your beer or he'll drink your beer.
Yeah. So they're very finicky. And this is actually out of Ireland a little bit. It's in other parts of the UK, but as we were talking about jack-o'-lanterns last week, there was a jack-o'-lantern that would actually, as the story goes, there was a young girl that was kind of singing as she walked along the road at night. And we know from our talks on Japan that you shouldn't walk along any lonely road at night.
That's right.
Alone. But she was singing and she got bored of her song, so she started singing a little ditty about the jack-o'-lantern, and she started to make fun of it. And it actually got irritated, and it ran right up to her and kind of thrashed her with its wings and ran away. According to the story, she was kind of touched in the head for the rest of her life, and she was never quite the same. So it's very similar to other stories in Ireland where you don't want to mess with them. You don't want to offend them even by speaking aloud, because you never know when they're there, when they might be listening.
I love that phrase there, touched in the head.
Touched in the head.
The best way to describe it.
It's a nice way of saying she was absolutely beep, beep, beep.
Pretty much from that point on, yeah.
Well, Richard, you mentioned earlier about how your girlfriend was talking about being out in the country, that it's still much more acceptable and more prevalent in terms of beliefs and superstitions. Are there any modern beliefs or superstitions that you know of, even for city dwellers, that you get a kick out of or people have fun with, especially during a season like Halloween?
Well, I suppose we've saved the best for last now of this month, because Halloween is, I suppose, the evolution of Samhain, the harvest festival in Ireland initially. So that usually used to take the form of a harvest festival where it symbolized the dark overtaking the light, which, if you peel that back again, was basically where the nighttime was becoming longer than the daytime, and that was passing over. So the whole thing was, and we've mentioned with the jack-o'-lanterns and everything, was to ward off the evil spirits that would be much easier to cross over, and I suppose coming over through the veil at that time, because the darkness was taking over. It was becoming the dominant force for the winter, and there used to be bonfire celebrations and jack-o'-lanterns being carved to ward off evil spirits, and there was festivals held to sort of celebrate all this and maybe to appease the spirits. So, as I said, there was people still to this day would be superstitious about especially building on farms, because there was a big renaissance of building when, I suppose, the Celtic Tiger, I don't know if you heard of that, there was a big building boom and economic boom in Ireland, and there was maybe motorways or roads being built through people's lands, and if there was maybe a road going through a ferry fort or a fairy ring, or people are building houses, there was a lot of superstition with regards to that, and there has been reports of people having bad luck with those. Whether you want to subscribe that being that there is actually malevolent force behind those is up to yourselves, but bad things have happened with regards to these fairies and otherworldly beings.
So it still sticks today then?
It does, definitely in Ireland. I'm not too sure outside of Ireland, as I can only speak for the region that I'm in, but it is something that is, I suppose, revered. I don't know, is that a right word? That's nearly putting it up on a pedestal, but people are maybe afraid of fairies still. I would be a skeptical man. I've mentioned I'm a scientific background, so if you can't put it on a chart, I don't really think it's worth mentioning. But this is the Monster Guys podcast, and superstition is the name of the game here, isn't
abound.
it?
Yeah, I think I want to say Iceland recently was in the news. Was it Iceland? I can't remember. Where there was a big fairy rock that set roadside. People have believed for centuries that you don't move that rock, you don't mess with that rock, and sometime in recent history, that rock was moved for construction purposes, and all manner of chaos and mayhem ensued. And so they, with cranes and heavy machinery, moved the rock back into place and built around it and did their work around it. And when they moved the rock back in place, everything became peaceful again. So there's something to be said about some of those happenings.
Moving away from fairies a little bit, because fairies comprise a lot of old Irish folklore, but ghosts and spirits of the dead, they sometimes cross into the fairy realm, but they still have that very distinct human element of people who have passed on to the next life. Does that hold any weight today? And what are some modern Irish hauntings?
Well, let me think about that now for a second. I think it probably does hold weight because I suppose like there would be superstition going on in general, especially in more rural communities. Even that people that would have traditionally had maybe a secular or scientific education, but if they're a little bit older, the older traditions would still carry through without maybe thinking about it. I think that they take as that's just the way it is because their parents would have believed it. Because like a lot of people take what their parents believe as fact, I suppose. Like it's very hard to be a critical thinker sometimes. And that's how generally people work. They think of, oh, what does my parents say? Or I'm very tangentially growing up in Ireland as a Roman Catholic. I don't know, have you ever seen the cartoon Hey Arnold? Yeah. That was the first time I had heard about the Jewish tradition. One of the characters was having a bar mitzvah and I was absolutely blown away because I had never heard of being a Jew before. So you can be in a bubble to an extent if you don't kind of reach far and wide. But I think in this internet generation, maybe you could maybe transcend or move past these superstitions, but there is definitely a lot of superstitions still in Ireland. That's all I can speak for.
Do you have any famous hauntings or famous ghost stories in Ireland that you can recall or that stand out to you today?
There's definitely the banshees around the place, and they're just wailing, animalistic ghosts. They definitely plague Irish folklore. So that would definitely be a prominent haunting in Irish society would be the banshee. I suppose maybe on a small note, myself and my friend when we were younger, we used to, I suppose it must have been a manifestation of our, I suppose, young, impressionable minds. We used to see this ethereal sort of entity. We used to call it, quote unquote, the black stuff. We used to see this entity that was just like a black glowing sort of mist. That was maybe our introduction to the paranormal. And it was just this shared delusion, I suppose. I'm going to call it delusion that we had. It was this scary entity that we were afraid would eat us all, but we haven't been eaten. I'm still alive today, and so is my friend.
Maybe the black stuff will come and drink the beer tonight. Maybe it's not the Cluricon that'll do that.
Well, I would toast to quote unquote the black stuff, and I'd hope that we put all our grievances aside.
Well, Richard, it's always good talking to you, and with so many of our Halloween traditions coming over from your shores to ours when we first came to this land, it's good to reach back into history a little bit and learn a little bit more of the origins of some of these traditions. It's been great talking to you these past few weeks during our Halloween in July campaign. Once more, before we get out of here, tell us where we can find you, your podcast, because people need to catch up on the Bizarre Cast.
First of all, guys, thank you very much for having me the last couple of weeks. It's been very entertaining, and I hope people have enjoyed the topics of discussion. And I know you've had multiple guests as well, filling us in on all these interesting topics. But you can find me on Twitter, is where we primarily interact, at The Fear Merchant, and you can get everything else on thefearmerchant.com and the Bizarre Cast. That's BAZAAR cast, or the Fear Merchant podcast. You can find me, and I interview lots of interesting people in the scene of horror, sci-fi, and the bizarre. Basically anyone I like to talk to, and people are finding that interesting currently, so I'm glad for that. But thank you very much for having me on, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope people enjoyed as much as I've had recording.
Well, we certainly have enjoyed speaking with you again, and we'll definitely be talking to you again in the future. I know it's late over there, and you're going to be country hopping in the morning with your profession, so we don't want to keep you any longer tonight.
That's not too bad. It's okay. I'm used to it now at this stage. A couple of weeks ago, I got up at 4 a.m. in the morning to guest on another podcast.
Okay.
So I'm well used to getting up on odd hours to share the very best in what I have to say.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard, and you take care of yourself. We'll be talking to you again very soon.
All right, guys. Best of luck now with the rest of the podcasts.
Thanks.
Good night.
Always a pleasure.
It's been a lot of fun talking with Richard this month, each week. Been very cool to hang out with him. He's a friend that we actually met because of podcasting, and I believe we met him through our good friend Chris Cavaretto from Werewolves in Siberia, or vice versa. To be honest with you, I can't remember. It's just been so cool to hang out with both of those guys over the past many months, and to have Richard on the show, to hear Chris's music all the time. It's just a lot of fun.
And chatting it up on Twitter. Those two are a hoot when you get them going on
Holy
Twitter.
cow. You want to have some fun on Twitter, go get in a conversation with those guys. Ton of fun.
All of the gifts you can imagine.
Yeah, definitely. So, Michael, take us where we want to go next. You've got some notes and thoughts on some of the stuff we spoke of previously and moving forward.
I want to kind of get into a deep legend about the Druids that I think a lot of people forget about. And we've talked a little bit about their bonfire, but a lot of people don't know what that's all about. So
Right.
the whole idea was that it's almost like an Olympic event in my mind.
I love fire, by the way.
Who doesn't?
Well, I know some people that don't, but I love fire. I love watching it. I love playing with it.
So this legend in my mind, I can't help but think of this druid running this Olympic torch mile or whatever. But the idea is that on Samhain, all hearths across Ireland are...
You say hearths. That's
all
interesting.
fireplaces.
All
fires.
hearths.
Yes.
All fireplaces, all mantled. I don't know.
They're all snuffed
Isn't
out.
it weird when we hear a word that we say one way and somebody else says it another way?
Tomato, tomato. Potato, potato.
I don't say those words.
Hakuna Matata.
Hakuna Matata.
And now we have Lion King stuck in our heads.
Okay, here we go.
But no, so anyways, you have all of the fires in Ireland being snuffed out, or at least all of the hearths, as you say. All of the bonfires and such. And this represents the season that's about to happen. The end of the Gaelic year, the end of the Celtic year, the season of darkness, of the fall, of the cold.
Which is my favorite time of year.
And this is when the veil is truly thin.
Right.
This is when a lot of this celebration is meant to appease the spirits, not necessarily the gods all the time. Although there are gods in that old folklore, a lot of them are just spirits that people are trying to appeal to and get along with.
Yeah.
Because they still have a heavy influence over the land. But this is also when some spirits will come out and, kind of like the jack-o'-lanterns and the Will-O-The-Wisps, they will purposefully mislead people into the bogs or even into the fairy mountains to be lost forever. Simply because, according to a lot of legends, man started to encroach on their land. So there's a very tense part,
kind of a running theme throughout mankind's history.
Oh, yeah. Even with ourselves.
Yeah.
But there's a very tense part of this thinning of the veil where, yes, the dead are closer. Yes, spirits are closer. Yes, the gods themselves are closer at times. And you want to be sure that you're on their good side. The second half of this is the bonfire. A great bonfire is created and lit. And then from that bonfire...
arise great marshmallows and s'mores.
Not quite.
Oh, sorry.
No Ghostbusters here yet. That's much later on in a completely different city and time. But no, this is where that weird Olympic druid comes to mind. But the idea is that torches are carried. The fire is carried back to all of those hearths that have been snuffed out to bring what is basically life back to the land. And this is meant to signify just that. The seasons ahead of time, the seasons that they hope will be bountiful after the season of darkness and after the season of cold, the new year, if you will. It's interesting because we were talking about the Morrigan earlier, and Dagda, or the goddess of death and the battlefield and gloom and despair, if you will, and then the god of life and fertility and magic. It's weird to think of them like this, but thinking again that this is the end of a Celtic year and almost like the new year at the same time, it reminds me of the images we have of the New Year baby and Old Man Time dying off.
Yeah.
It's a very similar image, very different, very epic in the old way of folklore and mythology, but definitely a lot of fun. And you were talking about divination earlier. Just like in the early 1900s and 1800s, this is where a lot of people would like walk up the stairs backwards with mirrors to see if they would be married properly, which was still a very dangerous habit.
Right.
During these older times, Samhain was when a lot of divinations were dealt with, specifically for marriage and weather of the coming year. Actually, ducking for apples, which is still kind of a big Halloween tradition.
Yeah, not for me. I'll tell you why later.
That was specifically a divination to see if you would be well married. The first person to bite an apple would be the first to marry in the coming year. And then there was something to do with peeling apple skin that I never caught the true origin of that, but it was a similar thing, which I'm glad I know where that comes from now, because ducking for apples has always been kind of gross to me.
Well, that's why I won't do it. I mean, have you ever seen a kid sneeze in the bucket and then go for the apple? I am not sticking my face in a bucket of apples where some snotty-nosed kid... No, thank you.
Especially back then when, you had the plagues and all of the...
Back then?
Yeah, I mean today.
I thought you were talking about like when I was a kid. I was like, holy cow, I'm not that old.
Either way.
The plague.
Today, modern times, or way back then. Ducking for apples just doesn't sound that appealing. But
yeah, I don't want anything to do with that.
We'd also talked about last week...
I'll do it symbolically.
I don't even want to do that. We were talking about last week about how people would stack up stones in their hearths. And if those stones were disturbed overnight, they would die. We had talked about how like that would be rife for pranks and also rife for heartbreak and disaster, I'm sure. But that's when all of these traditions were carried out, because it was that time of looking forward to the new year. And you bring a good point that the veil can thin every single day, or it can thin at any given moment if we choose to let it be so. But I feel like back then it was such a different way of life. This was something that was critical in timing. If they didn't get this right, they could very well die the next year. And so this was a moment where that veil was truly terrifying and well respected, and sometimes could be a joyful experience as well.
Very cool. Michael, let's switch over and speak with Icy. We have Icy waiting in the wings on us. Icy Sedgwick, good friend of ours, the digital pre-recorded wings, if you will. So
I was going to say, what type of wings are we talking about?
Yeah, let's switch over and hear what Icy Sedgwick from Northern England has to say about all this. Very interesting conversation with her. Okay, once again, we are with Icy Sedgwick from the northern lands of UK. Is that how you say it, Icy? Is it the northern? What do we call that part, that frozen tundra up there where you live?
Some people just call it the frozen north.
The frozen north.
But I'm in the northeast, so it's a very different climate from the northwest. So yeah.
That sounds so epic. The frozen north. That sounds like it should be in some kind of Lord of the Rings movie or something.
Sometimes it feels like we are.
I was going to say, isn't the place that all of the walkers come from in Game of Thrones?
Yeah, pretty much. This is a funny thing because I'm technically from north of Hadrian's Wall, because it actually comes into Newcastle, south of where I live. That does mean that I am beyond the wall.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, as we have been all month, we're talking about Halloween in July and topics associated with the celebration of Halloween, Samhain, and different things from around the globe. Icy, thanks again for joining us. This week we're talking about the spirit veil, or that thinning of the veil between the human world and the spirit world that is so commonly associated with Halloween or this time of year. It's always a very interesting conversation talking about this thinning of the veil. What are your thoughts? The existence of a veil, in talking with others from different cultures, some people, they say it doesn't exist. Some people say it's not really a veil, but it's almost like a parallel universe going on that is always coexisting. What are your thoughts? Do we have a veil or don't we?
I think whether you call it a veil or there's a parallel world or whatever, there's definitely some kind of boundary between the two. I think it's quite interesting, and it's funny that we're talking about this because I've just been doing some research on a couple of films involving the demonic, and there's always a sense that presences on the other side of whatever this border or boundary or fence is always need to be invited. And I think if there wasn't such a boundary, there would be no need for an invitation because they'd just be milling about among us all the time. So I think that there is definitely some kind of separating border, but what you choose to call it, I mean, calling it a veil makes it sound nice and romantic, but to me a veil then isn't penetrable. So I guess I quite like just thinking it of like a border more than anything.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. And a lot of people refer to this, and really this is more on a day-to-day basis, but the witching hour versus a time of year, it's more of just a time of night. It's a fairly common concept where a time when ghosts and ghoulies would be more active. I know some people from religious backgrounds would talk about praying during this witching hour time of night because there's less activity and more opportunity to infuse that power of prayer or meditation or whatever because there's less human activity taking place. And it's a little bit different than having certain times of the year like Halloween, but regular daily basis where the witching hour, that veil, so to speak, or that spiritual activity is more common. Coming from your part of the world and customs that you're familiar with, are there other times of the year other than Halloween where the veil seems to be thinner? And also, are there custom celebrations, rituals that you can speak to that are still highly observed today?
I think it's quite funny because obviously I think on the whole, the UK is a bit more, I don't want to say secular, but a lot less sort of prone to superstition than I think we perhaps were in days gone by. So I think things like the witching hour are something that you find in popular culture now rather than sort of everyday superstition. I mean, I did some research into the witching hour for a blog post, and it was quite funny because some people were convinced it was between 12 and 1, and others were convinced it was between 3 and 4. And the 3 and 4 one's often also called the devil's hour, and I find it absolutely hilarious because I was born between 3 and 4, which I think explains quite a lot. But again, it doesn't seem to be something that people commonly worry about. And the thing that fascinates me is obviously, there are sort of certain beliefs and so on about, this thinning of the veil at Halloween, but I often wonder, shouldn't there be a corresponding one at the other half of the year? So I suppose it would be, I can't even work out which one it would be. If it would be
probably the summer solstice,
midsummer, or if it would be earlier around about the spring equinox, would that not? But you'd never seem to sort of think about whether there'd be an equivalent elsewhere. I suppose you have it at Christmas, I guess. Some people believe that the worlds are a little bit closer around Yule, and obviously by extension Christmas, but I don't, again, it's not something that I think, it's quite sad in a way that there's not sort of as many customs and celebrations now as there used to be, and whenever there are, it usually seems to be attached to something else like a music festival or something like that obviously people across faiths can then get involved with without perhaps knowing what they're getting involved with. Like we have like May Day celebrations and so on. I don't know how many people who get involved with sort of maypoles actually know the original significance of them or not. So it's almost like people are covertly celebrating these things without actually realizing that they're celebrating them.
Yeah, I don't believe people have a clue. I would say the larger population. I do believe that there are a lot of people who are educated, and I think that education is increasing again. But for the most part, people, I'll be honest with you, I think most people think of Maypole and they think of the video with men without hats where they're dancing around that Mayfair. I don't even know if you remember that video from the 80s, but I talk to people about the Maypole, and they're like, oh yeah, that one in that video with men without hats. I just kind of slap my forehead and walk away.
It's funny that you mention like an opposite time period or an opposite time zone, or an opposite season that the veil will be thinner. In Japan, they actually, summer is basically the same time of year for us that things get creepy, which when we were talking to Matthew Meyer, he informed us of that. And I found that strange because usually you think of summer, you think of, bright, happy, going to the beach, just trying to cool off all the time. I guess where you have Day of the Dead and you have Halloween and you have Samhain, it's kind of a different look at the world.
I think it's, in a way, it's funny that you say that, because I know obviously when you have midsummer and everyone sort of celebrates the sun, but you think, yeah, but it also means that the nights are going to start getting longer and the days are going to start getting shorter. So it seems a really funny thing to to celebrate, whereas the coming of the sun at midwinter makes more sense because it means the days are going to start getting longer. So for me, I actually find summer the saddest season because obviously in the spring everything's waking up, all the animals are being born, and it's quite a positive time of year. But then summer's almost the bridge between that and then everything dying off again in the autumn. So I kind of find summer's a bit more of a weird season. I just always assumed that I thought that because I'm a bit weird, but it's quite nice to know that other cultures also think the same way and that it is a bit of a, because I don't necessarily see it as the direct opposite of winter, because in the UK you generally can't tell the difference between the two anyway. But I can see why some people would sort of see it that way. Because there is that impending autumn and, the trees are going to start shedding and, the days are starting to get shorter and all that kind of thing.
Right. And, you mentioned the spring time or the spring equinox being that corresponding time on the opposite side of the calendar. I was thinking summer solstice because of it having such prominence in so many traditions, especially coming from pagan traditions, in terms of celebration and ritual and the bonfires that take place there and the burning. And like you said, it's when we switch where we're now going towards, again, the darker nights, the longer, darker nights. And I think there's something there. You mentioned Christmas as well. A lot of people believe that wintertime all to itself, the cold thins the veil or allows us an awareness or an access to the spiritual. And again, it may just be an awareness. People just may not, the summertime people want to go to the beach. They don't think about dealing with ghosts. But many traditions do speak to the fact that summer solstice is second only to Halloween or Samhain or some of those traditions in the autumn. So I do think we have different points of the year where that veil, so to speak, is thinner or the access or the awareness is heightened. I think in our modern day, and especially in Western culture, we just don't think about that anymore. We're too worried about partying and beach and drinking.
I do wonder as well if there's a case to be made for, because we've talked a lot about times of year, and I do wonder if there's a case to be made for places being where it's... I mean, I'm thinking of, obviously the holes in the ozone layer, not quite on those sort of like level, but you do sort of wonder, are there places around the world where for one reason or another, like maybe Glastonbury, for example, would be quite a good... Obviously, I don't mean the festival, I do mean like the tour.
Right.
Or, places like that. Are there places where the boundary's a little bit thinner or a bit easier to cross? I mean, particularly when you look at sort of English folk tales and there's certain hotspots, as it were, of activity, and you think either the people there had really overactive imaginations or there was something going on there. So it does make you wonder. And why is it that New York's constantly plagued by ghosts and Ghostbusters? You know what I mean? It's kind of, you do have to think, like, is it the concentration of people in areas, or is it just for whatever reason that place is a little bit more accessible? I mean, I guess, like Buffy took it to the nth degree with the Hellmouth. Mm-hmm. But you do wonder, is that a consideration as well?
Yeah, I think there's always been a conversation considering population centers. Because, in the thought process that I've heard is the more people you have concentrated in an area, the higher the spiritual activity. If for no other reason, that population's own seeking or their own ritual, all that combined in a central location or a concentrated location increases the spiritual activity. So I think there is something to be said. But as well, to be honest with you, I have better, stronger, more heightened spiritual experiences when I go out in the woods by myself. I go on a walking trail. To me, I feel closer to anything out there spiritually when I'm alone out in a secluded, isolated location than I do inside of a city. So I don't know. It could boil down to the individual as well.
Yeah, I think for me, I always find, like if, for example, you're using the London Underground and it's quite late at night and there's only like 3 people on the platform, that feels really weird.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
I mean, the tube's a weird thing in there anyway, but, so I think it does just depend. I mean, obviously a lot of it comes down to, I think, a psychological effect as well. There's so much psychic interference from a big group of people. Whereas obviously if you're out in the woods and there's just you and nature, it's easier to to commune with such things. But I do think it just depends on, I guess it depends on almost like if people were like radios, what wavelength are you transmitting on?
Right.
So some people may be more FM, other people might be more medium wave.
Taking a look as well at other cultures again, during our talk with Matthew Meyer on Japanese folklore, he had talked about how a lot of yokai were found where you go deeper into the woods or deeper into the caves or into the places that people can't really habitate. That's where our sense of reality starts to blur. You kind of have the same thing in Ireland where, you have the fairy mounds where people can't really get into. And then you have places like Stonehenge, or in Russia, there is a specific stone that only certain shamans can go and touch, and they will basically take requests from people, and then they will go touch the stone or interact with it in some way to fulfill some sort of shamanistic duty or activity. So I feel like you've got the places on the fringes, and then you have those heightened places of mystery like the stone or Stonehenge, that veil, so to speak, seems to be a little bit more penetrable.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, it would certainly make sense. And I think as well, in a way, it's funny that you notice a lot of the places you mentioned are made of stone, or that earthworks in some description. And I think perhaps that speaks to some unconscious knowledge on the part of the person looking at them. When you think of how like ancient stone is, or how ancient earthworks and so on are, when you're kind of faced with that enormity of time, I guess in a way that kind of makes the brain go a little bit squiffy. Because you suddenly realise how tiny your place in all of it is. So, I mean, that might also sort of like lead to some kind of greater awareness or greater heightened awareness of what might be on the other side.
Yeah, definitely. And I love your word there. Did you just say squiffy?
Squiffy.
That's a good word. I need to add that to my word use list.
I mean, it usually means if someone's squiffy that they're drunk, but I quite like using it for anything that's just a bit weird.
Sometimes I get caught up in the word usage between different countries. I love how words come to be. And over here in America, I think we've gotten a little bit boring with our language. So
we have.
What, and you were talking about locations earlier. I was kind of reminded of our conversation that we had with you about the crossroads.
Yes.
And, that could be a prime example of this. And I'll include a link in the show notes to that conversation. But if anybody wants to go a little bit deeper with regards to a conversation about the crossroads, that's a fascinating thought all to itself. And we had a good conversation with Icy not too long ago, maybe just a month ago, I think, about that. So definitely something to tap in there. Icy, in talking about the spirit veil, or this thinning of access or the border between our worlds, are there any stories that stand out to you concerning this veil or this border?
I can think of a lot, but I'm going to share an actual experience that I had.
Oh, cool.
Because it was just so weird and I can't explain it. Obviously, Newcastle is a very old city. And I mean, it goes back to the Roman era, which was evidenced by the finding of some actual Roman shrines in the river. But we've got a cathedral, which I think it's about 12th or 13th century. Beautiful building, well worth a visit if ever you're in Newcastle. And I used to do ghost walks and ghost hunts around the city. And I'd actually gone on one as a customer rather than a guide, and we'd gone round the side of the cathedral, and we're in this sort of little, I don't know what you'd call it, it's not quite an alcove, it's just a bit where the building goes in then comes back out again. And the guide was trying to demonstrate something that they used to do to accuse witches, where they basically made them stand and face the church with their back to everybody. And I can't remember the reason why, because I mean it was must have been about 8 or 9 years ago that I did this tour, but I remember what happened next. So I'm standing because he decides he's going to pick on me, so I'm going to be the witch. So I'm standing facing in towards the corner with me back to everybody else, and there was this weird split second feeling where I was standing there, and you know how normally like when you've got your back to people you can still sense them there.
Yeah, definitely.
You can still like feel them behind you and like looking at your back. It's peculiar. I think it's probably some age-old hunter-gatherer instinct that we've never quite lost.
Right.
But so one minute I was aware that they were there, and obviously could hear them shuffling round, and obviously I could hear the guy talking. There was a split-second moment where I couldn't hear him and I couldn't hear them, and I was convinced I was going to turn round and that they just wouldn't be there. And it was kind of a little bit like almost slipping slightly either into a different time or also like just a different version of the city, if that makes sense. So it always makes me think of Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere and his alternate London, and I thought, oh my god, is there an alternate Newcastle? And I accidentally wandered into it for like a split second.
Wow.
I think when you have situations like that where you suddenly instantaneously, and it wasn't even conscious on my part, I was just aware of it, and then obviously all of a sudden the guide said something, and then it was kind of like I came back in partway through a sentence, and I was like, oh, thank God for that, they're all still there. And it was it really, really threw me because I couldn't explain it.
That is strange. Almost like you were slipping into, I think you said this, but almost like you were slipping into a different time frame versus crossing a border, but slipping into a different piece of history almost.
Well, if you want to get into relativity and everything, are time and space not the same in some aspects?
I mean, the thing, it is really funny, and it did kind of make me think of as well in our last conversation when you mentioned about as well as crossroads in places, crossroads in time, and you kind of think, wow, I could have been there just like 10 minutes earlier than we actually were. You know what I mean? It didn't necessarily follow that I had to have all of a sudden been standing there. It was like 1870 or something. It could have just been a few minutes before we came around the corner. So it was weird because it was a cross between just not knowing what was going on and deja vu. It was very, very odd.
Yeah, that is weird. And the whole deja vu conversation, I mean, we could go on about that just with regards to spirit veil or spirit borders. I have some theories there, but that is a strange experience.
I don't know. It was just absolutely strange. But it's never happened since. That's the weird thing.
Yeah, and now you want to go back and try to recreate it and experience it and tap into that power somehow, but you never can again.
I've tried. It doesn't work. It's really, really strange. Because naturally, like most people will be like, oh, that was really weird. I never want that to happen again. But of course, me being me, I'm like, oh, I want to see if I can do that again.
Right, right.
It's so I don't know whether I don't know. I mean, you know, you think of all the realms of horror fiction where things like that happen, and you sort of think, or have I picked the one spot that moves around town? So perhaps some drunk in the big market experienced it and didn't realise because he was drunk. I don't know. It's very odd.
This topic of the spirit veil, I think, is something that we as humans are eternally fascinated with and may never completely understand. Sometimes we may have those moments where we experience a little bit of it, like you were talking about, and sometimes I think we can hear things or see things or even smell things that, you know, may be just beyond our reach. And I think we're always going to be fascinated with it. But I certainly appreciate your insight and you sharing that experience with us. Icy, before we stop this call with you today, share with us how people can find out more about you and your writing and articles and things that you're working on.
Well, I keep most things on my blog, and I share articles about things to do with obviously folklore, but also the supernatural. Incidentally, one of my most visited posts is actually Are Ouija Boards Evil, which I found quite funny.
Oh, wow.
I think it might have been when Ouija 2 came out. That post got me so much traffic. And you can find those on my blog at icysedgwick.com. And sneaky plug, if you sign up for my newsletter, I'll send you a collection of weird short stories.
Yeah, and definitely worth it. We've actually retold one of your stories on our Fairy Tales podcast, so definitely worth it. A lot of value there in Icy's newsletter. Icy, I think recently you've just written a string of articles on voodoo, and
yes.
Maybe Papa Legba, I think, was one recently that I saw pop up. I haven't actually got to read that one yet, but you've got a great fascination with that whole culture and spirituality, and you've been writing on that recently.
Yeah, I've with that one, because I think there's so much misinformation out there. I've been really mindful of that, and obviously because it is a living, breathing religion and practice for people, obviously I've been trying to be sensitive towards that and actually try and portray it in a slightly more objective fashion rather than the pop culture version, which is 9 times out of 10 wrong.
Yeah, it is.
So I think it is fascinating, but obviously I'm very aware that it is also like an actual religion for people. So it's kind of like you don't want to be sitting there just spouting nonsense about it, because you can get away with that to an extent with ghost stories and so on, because it all depends on the perception of the person who first reported it. But obviously with something like voodoo, it's like it's a proper thing. So I feel it deserves a little bit more respect than some of the other topics I've done.
Yeah, definitely. And with regards to the spirit veil or our conversation today, that religion and belief system and some of the stories surrounding that is certainly a rich resource to go a little bit deeper from a different perspective into this veil or this border, more so than many religions and belief systems that I can think of.
Yeah, definitely.
Icy, thanks so much again for being with us. We certainly appreciate it and hope everybody is enjoying our Halloween in July event and that it's just preparing us a little bit more for just a couple of months away. We've got Halloween, Michael. I can't wait. So I hope this is bringing a little bit more fun. Icy, do you have, I'm putting you on the spot here, but do you have any costume or masks or makeup that you're gonna think about for this season, this Halloween season?
I must admit, we were talking obviously before about in the other show about masks, and in my head I do really want to have a go at doing one of the gender swap costumes, and I'd really love to try and do the Phantom of the Opera.
Oh yeah, that's a rich musical and text to pull from for costuming and makeup.
Whether I manage it or not is a complete other story, but that's the plan.
Well, if you do, we need to see pictures on the Monster Guys podcast. So, well, thanks again, and you have a wonderful day, and we can't wait to speak with you again in the future, Icy. Thank you so much.
Bye.
She's just another one of those people that every time you talk to her, you just feel smarter. Just like Matthew Meyer. It's just, and Richard as well. He's a smart guy, too. If you listen to his podcasts and his questions and some of the earlier conversations, all these people that we're talking to, they need to be the Monster Guys podcast because they're so much smarter than me.
Richard's very business-minded and very intelligent.
Science. Yeah, he's very science-minded. He's very smart with business and numbers and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
and beer.
He's
very good with beer too.
Well, I mean, Irish.
You better be
to delve into that Irish stereotype.
Yeah, no, but it's good having intelligent people to speak with and hear their perspectives. Really enjoy it, and it deepens the value of our conversation, I believe. Michael, here's a bit of trivia for you. I don't know if you know this. I think you do. We talked about it a couple years ago, maybe. Halloween is considered to be one of the oldest celebrated holidays and is in fact a global event. Obviously, we've talked about how the celebration was initially influenced by Celtic harvest festivals, possible pagan roots, particularly the Gaelic Samhain. There's a lot of religions and cultures laying claim to this holiday and its beginnings now, and some that have tried to appropriate it and make it its own, unsuccessfully for the most part.
Yeah.
But it's believed that Halloween began in Ireland about 2,000 years ago, maybe going back to that place, the Roth Crochan, the seat of the Morrigan. I don't know. However, there are historians, Halloween historians. Wouldn't you like that job?
I think, could this be a resume for
Maybe this
that
is
job?
a resume for that job. But they talk about, historians believe, Halloween's launch about 4,000 BC, which would make it about 6,000 years old. That's a long time ago.
I was going to say, that's a lot of candy.
That's a lot of candy corn and s'mores.
It's a lot of in need of being disinfected apples.
Yes, and caramel popcorn balls and Tootsie Rolls and chocolate and masks, creepy little plastic masks.
I feel like they didn't have the plastic masks.
Maybe
that far
not.
back.
Maybe not.
But they definitely had Tootsie Rolls.
I mean, what would you think candy would be like 2,000 years ago?
Probably deadly. I don't know.
I don't know. But it's pretty cool to think that Halloween has been celebrated in one form or another for possibly over 6,000 years. That's pretty cool.
That is. It's definitely a holiday to get right then and celebrate with everything in our hearts.
Yeah, and I just felt like you should know that little piece of historical trivia.
I feel like I've actually forgot the time frame there.
Did you also know that there is a fear of Halloween?
No. How could that be possible?
It is possible.
I think you're making that up.
I'm not. Do you know what it's called?
Halloween phobia?
No. Close. Samhainophobia.
Okay, that makes sense.
Is the fear of Halloween. So there you go. Now you are truly much smarter about this topic.
Now I can
and
go
with that being said,
apply for that job.
With that being said, let's go talk to Matthew Meyer from Japan about his perspective from Asian culture and Japanese culture specifically about the thinning of the veil or the spirit veil. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we have the privilege of having Matthew Meyer from yokai.com with us on the Monster Guys podcast for our Halloween in July fun. Michael, I think the last time we talked to Matthew, maybe 2 years ago on the podcast.
It's been too long.
It's been way too long. Matthew, welcome back to the Monster Guys podcast. How are you doing, man?
Thank you. It's great to be back. I'm doing really well.
So since the last time we talked, and we're going to bounce a little bit off of that conversation previously. So listeners, if you want to hear our previous conversation, we'll link that show in the show notes because it was a fantastic talk about yokai. But Matthew, since that talk, what have you been up to? I think you might have released another book, working on some other projects, and of course your art just continues to stun me, I know personally, every time I see something new come from you. So what's new with you?
Thanks. Around our last time we talked, I think it was just around the release of my second book, The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits, maybe just before or just after that. So I've been working on a Patreon project since then, and I've been building up a large collection of paintings that are going to eventually become a third volume of my yokai encyclopedia. I'm getting pretty close to the end of that. I expect to launch a Kickstarter project later this year, maybe in the fall, to launch the third book. Since then, I've moved back from the States to Japan. So I spent about 4 years in the States, and I was going to conventions and showing yokai and doing some lectures at universities and libraries. So now I'm back in Japan, continuing to, sort of immerse myself in the local yokai culture here.
That's very cool. Yeah, I do believe last time you had just released that book, and I can't wait for your next one. For people who may not realize it, after every one of our Yokai Tales podcasts that we do, your information is in the show notes for every one of our story podcasts dealing with yokai, because you have graciously given us permission to use some of your artwork with those podcasts. So if you want to see more of Matthew's work, go to yokai.com. It's probably one of the most significant and important pieces of work on yokai and Japanese folklore that we have in our modern day, in my opinion. And also at themonsterguys.com, you can see, associated with all of our yokai podcasts, Matthew's information and his artwork. So we certainly appreciate that. And Matthew, again, for anybody who may not know this, when we travel and do our talks and discussions on yokai, a lot of people may not know this, but we started doing ours, I guess, Michael, what, about 4 or 5 years ago on yokai, when nobody over here even knew what a yokai was. We got cross-eyed looks when we said yokai. But Matthew, you're one of our initial inspirations and sources of education on helping people understand what a yokai is or what yokai are, and all the various nuances related to that folklore. How much fun has it been for you to be out on the road talking to people at conventions and stuff about yokai?
It's fantastic. Kind of like you said, back when I first started doing this, there was really nothing at all in English, maybe a handful of books. And of course, in one book, you just can't cover the entire world of yokai that's out there. So it's been a real pleasure to sort of be working on this and expanding the amount of information available on yokai in English. It's amazing going to conventions where you talk to people and they say, hey, that image looks familiar, but I don't know what that is. And yeah, they've seen a kappa or they've seen some sort of Japanese monster in a video game or somewhere, and it just stuck with them. And then when they see my illustration, they come up and talk about it, and, it's a chance to introduce them to the entire world of yokai and say, hey, it's not just this one creature, it's hundreds and thousands of these creatures that all developed out of Japanese folklore, and here's this entire new world you didn't know existed, and let's talk about it.
Yeah, it's so much fun, and I can't thank you enough for the resource that you provide to help people like us talk about and learn about yokai and then spread that word to others around here in the United States. It's just been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yeah. In our previous interview with you, and we're going to go into some of our questions about tonight's topic now. As you know, and as our listeners know, have been following us all month, we're doing a Halloween in July campaign on the Monster Guys podcast. Just something fun, getting ready for the Halloween season. I don't know, Matthew, if you remember, when you're here in the States, sometimes businesses and offices will do something called a Christmas in July.
Oh, sure, of course.
Yeah, where they'll try to party up a little bit with Christmas themes. Well, we decided that Halloween was better than Christmas. So we're doing Halloween in July all month and getting ready.
Well, I agree with you there, and I think that's a great idea.
Just we're getting ready for one of our favorite times of the year, and right in the smack dab heat of the summer, so hopefully it mentally helps us cool off a little bit. But in the last time we talked to you, we briefly got into the discussion about twilight. If I remember right, the word twilight kept coming up in relation to yokai, a time where they were more accessible or easier to see. And it's something that we kind of say around Halloween, as you're familiar with some of the Celtic festivals and now the U.S. festivals around Halloween, the veil, the spirit veil, that begins to thin that time of year. There's a concept or an idea where the spirit world and the human world either overlap a little bit or begin to merge, or those lines begin to blur. We kind of touched on that a little bit in our discussion about yokai with you. What can you tell us about the spirit veil or that twilight time where yokai are easier to see, where that spirit world and the human world begins to blur? Can you deepen our understanding on that with regards to Japanese culture and yokai?
Sure, yeah. That was actually the topic, or the theme of my second book, which is why I gave it the name The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits.
Yes.
So that the Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits is maybe the literal translation of a Japanese word, omagatoki, which is sort of a archaic and poetic way of saying twilight. It literally means the hour of meeting evil spirits, and it's describing that period after the sun sets, and the sky is still a little bit light, so you can still see, but maybe everything is covered in shadows, and you can't make out details. Everything is quite fuzzy. So it's this sort of border period between day and actually darkest night, where people are still out and about, but they're all getting ready to go back to their homes. So you're still, interacting with people. And there's another interesting word for twilight in Japanese. The word is tasogare. And this is sort of a more of like a poetic word, but it comes from an old dialect, and it basically means who goes there or who's that over there. And the idea is that, you might see a person, but you can't see their face. So you actually have to call out, hey, who are you, when you see this person? And if they don't answer you, there's, a chance it might be an evil spirit or something. We've seen how in Japanese folklore we've got faceless spirits. There's creatures like the noperabo, and all sorts of creatures that either don't have faces or have very disgusting looking faces and grotesque bodies, but they look kind of like people. So If you were to encounter one of them on the street, you would hopefully call out and a human would answer, and you would be relieved.
Very much so.
That kind of makes more sense now, thinking back to the story, the very bizarre and very short story of the Shirime.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think we've covered that a couple times on the podcast, but for those who don't know, it's very similar occasion where somebody's walking down the beach and they call out, and instead of answering, after the second time of saying hello, the person sees the figure coming toward them on the beach turn around and basically moon them, only there's a giant eyeball instead of a butt. So it's one of my favorite goofy and yet somehow terrifyingly bizarre creature in Japanese folklore.
Yeah, and that describes a lot of yokai, I think. Goofy and still terrifying. It's a pretty good description for yokai.
Yeah, definitely. So, Matthew, give us those two words again that you just threw at us.
Sure. The first one is omagatoki.
Omagatoki.
Right, and that's the hour of meeting evil spirits.
Okay.
And tasogare is the twilight word.
Tasogare.
Yes.
Okay, so would I pass my Japanese language with those two words?
Your pronunciation was fine. Yep.
Oh, good. I get concerned about that in some of our stories, that we're going to get angry people calling us about our mistranslation or mispronunciation.
Yeah, fortunately, Japanese pronunciation isn't too terribly difficult. It's a little bit similar to Spanish pronunciation, so you don't have to twist your mouth in really awkward ways. You just have to practice saying the word a few times.
Yeah. Well, there are several yokai that seem to exist within nature. The kappa, the tsukumogami. Are these affected by the veil, that blurring that we talk about? Or are they always, so to speak, in our human world? And are they any easier to see during times like twilight?
Certainly things like tsukumogami, which are made from common household objects, they're around all the time. They don't sort of appear at night. They're always there, but maybe they become a little more active when you're not looking at them. And of course, to the ancient, I don't really want to say ancients, but to the Japanese of yesteryear, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Right.
you're talking about a country before modern science and modern biological classifications were popular. So the idea of the real world and the supernatural world was a little less defined as it is today. So to say that a magical fox is supernatural and a regular fox is natural, that splitting didn't really exist. So I think probably the people who actually did believe in yokai, during their times, there wasn't so much of a difference between what's a natural spirit and what's a supernatural spirit. I think it was all just one continuum of life. But there are definitely creatures that live in our world. So Kappa are water spirit, of course, so they live in rivers, and Kodama are tree spirits, they live in trees. And then there's some other creatures like Oni, which come from hell, which is not really of this world. And there are ghosts, of course, who are not natural, but they come from dead people. And there are even weirder things that don't even have names, but you see them in the Night Parade of 100 Demons picture scrolls.
Yes.
Just bizarre goblin-y creatures that are just spilling across the scrolls, dancing and partying as they go. And these things don't necessarily have a connection in the human world. They're not artifact spirits. They're not animals. They're just goblin-y monster type of things. These creatures lived in probably what they would consider like a magical fantasy world. I guess you could kind of view it as an analogy to the Irish idea of fairy, the kingdom that sort of exists alongside our world, and it's where the supernatural creatures live.
Right.
In Japanese, this is called ikai. We live in a world that's called sekai, which is just the Japanese word for the world. It's the world of things, the world of man, our universe. So the supernatural world was called ikai, and that's where a lot of these creatures would have originated from.
I'd like to see that world, but at the same time, I don't want to bring that on myself.
Yeah, it would be fun to see who and what lives there. Although I'm not even sure that the Japanese who believed in ikai as an actual place, I'm not sure they necessarily believed it to be a separate world. It may have just been part of our world that people don't go to. You know, if you go deep enough into a cave, you might emerge on the other side, and there you are in this strange world where yokai live. It's not necessarily another plane of existence. I don't think that concept really came about until the 20th century, when we were sort of looking at these beliefs and analyzing them. I think the actual folkloric beliefs themselves are not so well defined in those terms.
That's very interesting, and that again parallels a lot of European folklore. For the longest time, historically, we didn't believe that there was another world. We just believed we coexisted, but we're not always aware or couldn't always see, or we weren't in the right places all the time.
Yeah, I think that's more likely. Maybe we as modern people tend to really analyze things, particularly those of us who play video games, and we want to know the background and we want to go read the wiki and figure out all the meta behind this universe we're playing in. So we tend to apply that same line of thinking. I mean, I play Dungeons and Dragons, so, you know, one of my favorite books is the Manual of the Planes, which talks about all the different worlds where the monsters live in and where they come from. So there's a temptation to apply that same thought process to folklore. And really, when it comes to folklore, it's much more blurred than that. You can't clearly define it. So there's a temptation to say, oh, well, if you cast this spell and go to this place, you'll find a portal to Ikai. But I don't think that sort of thinking is true to the original folklore, although there's certainly nothing wrong with it as far as an entertainment sense goes.
Just this line of discussion makes me wonder if the spirit veil, so to speak, maybe the spirit veil is nothing more than our awareness or lack of awareness or perception.
Yeah, I think that's probably an interesting way to look at it, probably an accurate way to look at it. It's a term that's sort of applied post hoc. You know, we look back at the beliefs, and when we describe it, it does appear that there is some sort of veil separating these worlds. And it's sort of a post-analysis version of folklore.
I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you described it as almost like the Irish folklore. We talk about how the people in Ireland were not the first people to live on that island, but they went and were part of a kind of a three-way war. And the other residents were giants, and then you had another race that later would become the Fae, or the Fairy. And when they were defeated, they retreated back into their burial mounds in their world. Like you were talking about with Japanese folklore, it doesn't really describe another plane of existence. It just talks about them kind of going away, deeper into the hills and the darker places?
Yeah, I think it just describes it describes something that people think just is there. It's just in a place where you can't access it. With Japan in particular, it's such a mountainous country that a lot of the country is inaccessible and uninhabitable. You just can't get into these deep mountains. So the only people who would ever go far away from civilization would be woodcutters or maybe travelers or potentially monks who are going on hermitages and things like that. So the few people who did travel deep into the woods, they might come back with strange stories, and those stories would spread, and those would form the basis of folklore. So the idea that there's another world out there, it's really just the world that we're not used to seeing. It's still our world, but it's where we don't go and where we can't go.
That's fascinating that you say the woodcutters, the monks, people like that. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but, well, I'm sure you are, being a folklorist, but here in America in the early days, it was the frontiersmen. It was it was the guys who were out there in the wilderness and making their way, cutting new paths, that were the ones that were coming back with the strange stories.
Yeah, that's why you get so many rich American stories from the West, like, Paul Bunyan. These are all frontiersmen stories. It's because those were the people going into this land that nobody else has gone into before and bringing back their tales.
So you'd get these stories of crazy looking animals that maybe nobody has ever seen. And of course, with a little bit of the appropriate drink and maybe campfires and embellishment, you get some tall tales.
Naturally.
But it's all very interesting because, we seem to again and again run into this same theme no matter what part of the world we're in, about how some of these stories come to be. So again, maybe this veil that we believe exists is really just an awareness, really just something that's in our minds that we want to believe. We want to have that story. We want to have that tall tale. And it's very entertaining and exciting and scary all at the same time, but we certainly want to pierce that veil, I think, more often than not.
That's definitely true, I think.
So I want to ask a question, but I feel like because it's a little localized to a certain temple, it kind of requires a pre-question of sorts. So let me start with that for our listeners. Could you explain real quick, or just however you'd like to, the hours according to the zodiac?
Sure. Of course, everyone knows the Chinese zodiac with the rat, the ox, let's see if I can remember them all, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, sheep, monkey, rooster, dog, and the boar. It's slightly different in Japan than in China. So you have the boar instead of the pig, and you have cow instead of the ox. But it's basically the same across East Asia. So this is not just for the years. I think everyone knows the Chinese years because you go to a Chinese restaurant and it's there on the placemat, and you look up what year you were born in. So
right.
Everyone kind of knows their zodiac year. But this was used for all sorts of things in old China and old Japan and all over the Chinese sphere of influence. There were not just a 12-year cycle, but the months were designated for the animals. The days of the year were associated with the animals. They were associated with directions, and they were associated with hours of the day. So one of the entries in my book, The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits, is called the Shrine Meeting at the Hour of the Ox, or Ushino Kokumairi is the Japanese name. So this is the name of a very famous curse in Japan, which is visiting a shrine at the hour of the ox and performing a specific ritual. So the hour of the ox is what you hear most of the time when you're talking about the old curses and, the old way of measuring time. And that's because the hour of the ox is sort of the darkest part of night. Each of these animal hours was 2 hours long in our time. There's 24 hours in a day, 12 animals, so each animal gets a 2-hour slot. So the hour of the ox was between 1 in the morning and 3 in the morning. So this is the period when it's darkest of all. The sun is down, completely down. The moon has usually set by this time, so this is sort of the pitch black. It's maybe the closest thing to what we would call the witching hour in English. So this is when people went about and did the darkest deeds, trying to perform curses on people and such.
Black magic, so to speak.
Yeah, black magic. Yes, exactly. So it's strongly associated with those kind of curses. So in Japanese, if you say ushimitsu, which is the third part of the hour of the ox, That's sort of associated with this darkest dark and has a little bit of a creepy connotation to it.
Okay, so you have like Twilight, which is where you start to see more activity with the yokai and such, and then you have the Hour of the Ox, which, if I remember correctly, that's also where a lot of demons come out, not just yokai.
Yeah, the Hour of the Ox is generally what you would consider to be when the evil spirits are at their strongest. Again, this isn't really hard defined in folklore. There's not really a specific canon that says, oh, monsters are weak in the sun and strong in the night. But that's sort of just a general belief that just exists. It just sort of floats out there. So, the idea that during the daylight we can see, we're out and about, and we're not getting killed by monsters, so probably they're not very strong during the day. But during the night we hear weird sounds, our houses creak, you hear things out in the woods and you can't go investigate it. Yeah, those must be evil spirits. So, the thinking goes that there are more spirits out in the night than the day. And if that's the case, then when it's darkest out, they're probably strongest. So there's sort of a logical thinking that leads to the idea that during this Hour of the Ox, that's when the evil spirits are at their strongest point. But again, there's no doctrine or anything that really says that that's true.
There are some, I guess you would say, a similar sentiment that courses through many religious beliefs along that same line. I know of people from a couple of different religious belief systems or disciplines that would say, I'll pray more during the darkest hours of night because that's when more evil activity or demonic spirits would be awake because there's less human activity to interfere. They'll go about their business during those times of the night. So those are the times when people who pray might pray, or people who may do other ritual may prepare for that time of night. So it's an interesting thought because coming from a religious study, there's certainly quite a bit of discussion in religious circles about the middle of the night, so to speak, or that witching hour.
Yeah, I certainly think it's probably a common human thing. We tend to feel safer when we see other humans around and when we can move about and see clearly, and we tend to feel less safe during the dark when we're alone. And so it's natural to make up stories about those particular things. So I'm sure you'll find analogies to that in every culture.
And of course, as everybody knows, the freaks come out at night. So,
that's right.
Normal people sleep.
So can you tell us a little bit? You'd mentioned earlier, and I remember vaguely the curse at that specific shrine, but I don't remember it well enough to really describe it for our listeners. Could you describe a little bit more what happens during the Hour of the Ox at that shrine in Japan?
Sure, yeah. So the Ushino-koku Mairi, it's not necessarily restricted to a specific shrine, but one of the most famous shrines in Japan is the Kifune Jinja in Kyoto. It's a very popular shrine, so just being a popular shrine, it also ends up being targeted by people for black magic, of course. And, police reports today, every once in a while will still appear saying that they've found a straw doll nailed to a tree in the shrine grounds. And, that's a problem for numerous reasons, of course. These nails can harm ancient trees, and, it's just generally not a good thing to have people going about at night cursing other people. But the basic idea behind this curse is you're trying to hurt somebody. In most cases, in most stories, it's somebody who jilted you, a lover, or maybe they cheated on you, or often there's passion involved. So you have to dress up in white robes and paint your face white, and this is thought to be so you look like a ghost. Maybe so other ghosts won't bother you if they're wandering around at night, or maybe just to be creepy. You have to wear a trivet on your head upside down with candles on the legs of it. So you kind of have this crown of candles and flame. You also carry a mirror and a knife. It's thought the knife is in case somebody should see you, you have to kill them because you're performing something that's so evil that you don't want any witnesses. And you also wear special geta, which are Japanese wooden sandals. These geta have a single tooth. If you've ever seen Japanese sandals, they've got sort of the two teeth that you walk on, and they make that distinctive clip-clop sound when you walk. These ones have a single tooth, and they're very tall, so they're difficult to walk around in. So there's sort of a specific ritual and a specific garb that you have to wear when you're doing this. And then what you do is basically you sneak into the shrine during the Hour of the Ox, and you approach one of the sacred trees in the shrine. Usually these are the big trees that have a rope tied around them. There's sort of a holy tree in Shinto. And you're going to nail the doll through the tree using specific size nails. They don't normally sell these nails in hardware stores, so it's something you have to get specifically for the purpose of performing this curse. So there are actually websites out there now that sell curse sets, including a straw doll and nails of the right size that you can order. And they have warnings on the site that ordering these things is illegal, so you have to make sure you do it carefully.
Wow.
That's crazy.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah, it's definitely a scary thought that there are still people today who would go through with such a curse like this, but it does make for some interesting visuals.
Michael, I think in your last Yokai Tales story for our podcast, it was a 2-part, The Disappearance of Aikawa. You referenced some of this, the Hour of the Ox and certain locations, not necessarily this curse or anything, but there was kind of a sense of the main character trying to pass through this veil to get to a certain world at this time of night. So kind of an interesting correlation there.
Yeah, as we're sitting here talking about it, I was thinking back to it, and I'm glad you bring it up, Matthew, because mine is probably not the most accurate when looking at the older folklore, but it's something that we've talked about before, that folklore is something that changes as people continue to tell stories and expound on what was there in the past.
Yeah, I always hesitate to say that something is wrong or right in regards to folklore, because folklore is full of contradictions all over the place, and part of the joy of reading folklore is seeing what's different about it and what changes. So there's talk about what's authentic and what's correct, but I think that's a hard thing to say, because what's correct today, in 20 years or in 100 years, it might be something totally different.
Well, I think it's a relevance. A relevance to who's telling the story and who's listening to the story. What lesson is being taught, or what emotion is being expressed, or just what piece of entertainment, for laughter or for a good scare. So I've heard you say this before, and I believe this fully. Folklore is of the people, by the people, and I think it's just a matter of relevance as to what part of the world you're in and your audience, both on the telling and the listening side.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's an important difference between folklore and mythology, whereas mythology sort of has a canon. The 12 Labors of Hercules, they're sort of set. I mean, you can find small variations on them, but there is generally a correct version of the 12 Labors of Hercules. And same thing with other myths like the Iliad or the Odyssey. There's a correct version of those. When it comes to folklore, there are written versions, and sometimes people will turn to those and say that those are the correct versions. But those are, to me, I see those written versions of folklore as documentations of a contemporary perspective of folklore, whereas actual folklore is so impossible to define. And that's why, defining yokai is a difficult thing to do too, because if you over-define them, you remove that mystery and that essence of what they are. And that's the same with folklore. If you over-define it and if you canonize it like that and set it in stone, then it's not really folklore anymore. It's got to have that degree of vagueness to it.
Yeah, I don't think we want to apply the scientific method to folklore and to yokai.
Yes, yeah. I think Mizuki Shigeru, one of the most famous yokaiologists in Japan, said that electricity is what killed the yokai, because when people had electric lights, they could keep light on all the time, the shadows vanished. But I think there's also a metaphor in there that with electricity, we became able to clearly define everything around us, and we became more obsessed with specifically defining what we see in the world. We became a much more scientific people. So not just the presence of electric light, but the mentality that came with technology and that sort of thought, forcing us to label things and define things clearly, that eliminates the potential for the vagueness that's required to believe in folklore.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's a very interesting and profound line of thought. Yeah, so that's good sharing there. Matthew, are there any other, we talked about woodcutters and travelers and monks and people who go into far-off places. Are there any other special locations where the quote-unquote veil is thinner or easier to pass through, apart from just time frames or people going deep into the wood or into a mountain pass or something?
Well, yeah, and again, I think this comes down to something that's less defined by the stories of the time and more observed after the fact by yokai and folklore researchers. But when we encounter yokai, it tends to be in places that you would consider to be the borderlands. So, we mentioned the border between the wilderness and civilization, and that's why you've got so many stories that come from woodcutters and people who travel out into the wilderness. The border there is sort of one separation between our world and their world. But then you've also got a lot of yokai that appear at the border between land and sea. There's a lot of sort of beach yokai and sea yokai that you can see them from the shore, but you can't really reach them. And sort of this is another sort of borderland between humans and the natural world. Caves, of course, are a major one. And you see this not just in Japanese folklore, but in other countries' folklores where caves sort of have a magical connotation to them. There's a few specific areas in Japan, like Mount Osore up in northern Japan, which is supposed to be the entrance to hell. So there are actual specific places where you can travel between worlds. But in general, I think the idea of the spiritual veil that separates our world from the other world, it can be found anywhere, but it's thinnest at the places where there's a border between civilization and nature. You also see this during seasons and during specific days of the year. And a lot of this has to do with astrology and Chinese cosmology, which was big in Japan. But particularly the changing of the seasons was always thought to be powerful with that sort of yin-yang magic. And so there are certain yokai that come about during certain seasons or during the changing of the seasons and during certain days of the year. So there's a lot of not just physical border, but temporal borders that we encounter that also allow yokai to pass into our world.
Michael, I may preempt a question you're going to ask here in a moment, but Matthew, I want to go back just a few minutes ago. You said that there are specific places you can cross over into hell, what is believed to be a type of hell in Japan. And if I'm not mistaken, there are some celebrations or times of the year or rituals where those places can be accessed, or those places have celebrations surrounding those more often or easier access. Is that accurate? I don't know if I'm asking this the right way. I'm just trying to think. I know I've heard of entrances to hells and celebrations or rituals at certain times of the year in the same discussion. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. So I mentioned Mount Osore being probably the most famous entrance to hell in Japan, but there are other local entrances to hell, particularly in areas where there's active volcanoes or hot springs, and you've got steamy caves that have, vapors coming out of them, sometimes toxic. Those are generally thought to be, passageways to hell. But the most obvious time that would come to mind would be Obon, which is a major Japanese holiday that takes place during August.
Yes, okay.
That is a festival to honor the dead. So it has its roots in Buddhism as well. But this holiday, generally the idea is that the dead come back to visit their families. Speaking of what we do today during Obon, it's sort of a time for families to reunite. People who live in Tokyo will drive all the way back to their hometowns, wherever they be. And, you have big family reunions for a few days. There's no work. And you spend some time with your family, you visit the family graves, you wash the graves, clean the weeds off of the family tombstones, things like that. So there are definitely connections to the dead and to the ancestors. On yokai.com and also in the Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits, you can see my entries on hell and the road to hell, which are Jigoku and Meido, respectively. And they talk about sort of the process that a soul goes through to reach hell. And I think on those days, in those entries, I also mentioned the holidays in hell, when King Enma, the Lord of Hell, opens up all the boiling pots and allows the souls out, sort of to have a miniature vacation to go back to visit their relatives. And after that, they come back to hell to continue their torture.
I didn't know that was a thing, actually. Wow. Well, that actually kind of answers my question then, because I was going to ask, that's very similar to like the Mexican Day of the Dead and to Halloween, where we believe that spirits either just come to the mortal world or specifically that spirits come to visit their families and be near them.
It's interesting that you've got these similar ideas existing in cultures that really didn't have connection with each other. So they're not developed by being inspired by each other. They just developed independently of each other, but they do look similar to us.
Yeah, and I was going to say, when you said Obon, that kind of struck a nerve with me, because I do believe I've read that Obon in Japan is similarly related to our celebration of Halloween, but even more specifically, Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, because of the visitation of the spirits and the honoring and the celebration. Am I correct in that? There's a similar relation, and I believe even Obon has, and I'd have to go back and look it up, but has a close relation to the Wheel of the Year in witchcraft celebrations. Am I correct in that? I'm trying to go back in my memory. It's been such a long time since I've read on some of these celebrations that it seems that day in Japan closely relates to one of those ritual celebrations, and then our Halloween and Day of the Dead in America and in South America.
Well, I think there's not an actual relation between them because there's no connection. So they're not actually connected by any sort of common history or anything like that. However, there are a lot of similarities between them. I think if you were to just look at them as an outsider, you would think that they didn't look very similar at all, because on Halloween, we're running around with masks collecting candy, and on Day of the Dead, you've got amazing decorations and sort of celebrations, whereas Obon is much more of a family thing. And while there are celebrations around that season, they're not necessarily related strongly to Obon, as they are just additional celebrations to celebrate the summer holiday. Obon itself is much more of a family gathering and cleaning your graves, very strongly related to honoring your ancestors sort of thing. So I think if you were to look at maybe an ancient version of Halloween, you might find a little bit more in common with Obon, but while the origins of all of those holidays are similar, I don't think there's anything that's actually related between them.
Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. Michael, did you have any other questions for Matthew at this time?
No, my head's reeling with information. I love talking to you because you're an amazing source of information, so I'm still a bit of a fanboy there.
Well, yeah, I always feel much more intelligent after talking to you, Matthew. So it's always...
I'll leave you with one more fun little fact then.
Yes.
So I like that you mentioned how you were having Halloween in July. Of course, I'm a huge fan of Halloween as well, but you might be interested to know that in Japan, although Halloween is slowly beginning to pick up popularity here, it's still relatively unknown. Summer is actually the time when people celebrate ghosts in Japan. And part of that is related to Obon, of course, but also the main reason is that just the idea that ghost stories will chill you. So, you listen to a scary story and you feel shivers down your spine.
Yes.
So that's sort of the poor man's air conditioning, I guess.
Right.
So in the US, when we want to see horror movies, you generally have a glut of horror movies coming out in October and beginning of November. That's scary season. But scary season in Japan is summer. So we're just entering summer now, and there's all sorts of new horror movies that are going to be coming out, and art exhibitions featuring paintings of ghosts, and yokai celebrations all happen during the summer. So summer is the season for yokai and ghosts in Japan.
Is there a specific time of the year? Would this be the time of the year when they present the yokai train, or is that another time?
That is summer. I don't know what day it is this year, but yeah, the yokai train is during the summer.
Yeah, and people, if you haven't checked out what the yokai train is, you need to go look that up. That is a ton of fun, probably except for little children.
But I was going to say, fun for some people.
It's fun for most people, I guess. Matthew, just on a side note, I think I heard you have a friend in the background there. Do you have a bird or a friend that's hanging out with you there?
Yeah, I do. I've got two birds. I was trying to get them to be quiet, but sometimes they get excited when they hear my voice and they start to chirp. I've got a parakeet and a Bork's parrot.
That's cool. And I think that's the joy of some of what we do is we get to meet new friends like that just off the cuff. So
yeah, unfortunately, their voices are at the perfect pitch, so every microphone picks them up loud and clear. Even though if you're in the room with them, they're not that loud. The microphones pick it up 100%.
That's awesome.
We don't mind.
Tell us once more, Matthew. Of course, we'll have it in the show notes, but best place to find more information about what you're doing, your book, so on and so forth, for our listeners. Give us that info.
So you should visit yokai.com, yokai.com. That's where I keep my online encyclopedia of yokai and Japanese folklore. You'll also find links there to both of my books, The Night Parade of 100 Demons and The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits, as well as a link to my Patreon project, which is how I support myself while creating these yokai. Or not how I support myself, how people like you support me to create these yokai and allow me to create them on a full-time basis.
And I will say just a tremendous amount of value, resource, education, and entertainment at all of these places. So I highly encourage everybody to check out Matthew's resources online and get your hands and your eyeballs on his books. Matthew, again, thank you so much for hanging out with us again. Hopefully it won't be 2 years until we talk again. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to go ahead and throw it out there. We're going to talk to you soon about doing another presentation for our Yokai Tales podcast specifically. But until then, just thank you so much for being with us tonight. You've really brought a lot of great information to the table and a lot of good things to think about, especially with regards to that spirit veil or that thinning of the veil from the perspective of Japanese culture. So
again, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and it's really cool to see the insight into Japanese folklore with you.
Thank you very much.
Good night, Matthew. Thank you so much for all that you do.
Good night.
Very cool to get to spend some time with Matthew again. Good friend, somebody that we've spoken to periodically over the last few years, and he's been our show before. If you missed that episode, it's way back towards the beginning when we did a series of talks on yokai. We talked to him and Zach Davison at one point, interviewing both of those guys. Man, I feel like there's a depth and a wealth of knowledge there from a cultural standpoint. Always good to hear from him.
It always is. And when we contacted him about this topic, I wasn't sure if he'd be up for it, just because as he states in there, Japanese folklore does talk about this in a way, but it doesn't specifically say anything about a thinning of the veil. So
yeah,
when he agreed to do the show and gave me his initial thoughts, I was kind of like, yeah, that's brilliant, and it comes at it from a completely different angle, and I was already geeking out before we talked to him. So
yeah, so good times there. Michael, you've got some other notes on some traditions, more modern perspectives on this concept of Halloween and the spirit veil.
I do. So this is actually something that I came across while we were researching for our Jack-o'-lanterns episode, and I kind of stored it in the back of my head because it did fit in with the idea of the spirit veil. But you'll see how that kind of ties in here in a second, but this is actually going to be how we get the phrase trick or treat.
Ah, okay.
Have you ever wondered where we get that phrase?
I am wondering that right now.
Okay. I guess as a kid, I just thought it was always a thing. I didn't really ever think about when did this actually become a thing?
Probably 6,000 years ago.
Not quite. More like, well, I guess not 50 years ago at this point. It'd be closer to 7 or 8 or, I don't know, math. So the idea is that Scottish and Irish immigrants bring over the tradition of Mischief Night, which is, a little bit before Halloween. Did they bring that
along with their turnip heads?
Yes, they did.
Okay.
Yes, they did.
Their turnip lanterns.
So Mischief Night in the old country and in the U.S. when it was brought over basically is, when you dress up for your kid as Santa Claus and you get up on the roof and you make the jingle bell noises and...
I do not.
Mm-hmm.
I have no recollection of that whatsoever.
I have very strong recollections of that you should remember. But yeah,
I almost fell off of the roof when you were doing that.
I remember
mess.
that too. Mischief Night is kind of like the same thing for Halloween. So it's when you, usually as a youngster with a gang of other youngsters, go and tip over outhouses, unlatch gates on the fences.
So it's like the juvenile version of Hell Night.
Basically, yeah. I mean, okay, that's the thing is that it started off as mostly harmless.
Mostly.
Yeah. Today we might go egg a house or we might TP somebody's
roll
front
a
yard.
House, yeah. Smash a mailbox. No, don't do that. Don't do that.
Well, that's where things
Some
started to turn.
people have done that. That's where it kind of leads to. We are not condoning that.
So Mischief Night was basically just pranks, good old-fashioned pranks. Some of them were a bit more, obnoxious than others, but the idea was that you were acting as the fairies and that the fairies were coming out at night because of that thinning of the veil and messing with the world around you.
Mm.
What happened is back, I want to say the 1920s, 1930s, that was a very stressful time.
Right.
So that actually started to become more violent. Destruction of property became more rampant, but you also have violence that happens towards people, cruelty towards animals. One researcher had actually mentioned that it may not have any correlation, but it is of note that the Ku Klux Klan actually started to reach some of their peaks of violence during those eras, especially on that night. So it actually became, like you said, the Hell Night, things starting to go too far.
Yeah.
So you actually start to have this phrase pop up, and I think the first phrase, the first time it's recorded is in 1938. I'm going to read it off here, but it's in 1938 from an article in the Los Angeles Times. The headline was, Halloween Pranks Plotted by Youngsters or Southland, and it reads, Trick or Treat is the Halloween hijacking game hundreds of Southern California youngsters will play tomorrow night as they practice streamlined versions of traditional All Hallows Eve pranks. It was in 1941 that phrase actually showed up next in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So you start to get this phrase that's being tossed around after things go too far for the purpose of promoting a more fun Halloween again. Trick and treat.
Right.
So it's showing the youngsters some discipline. And it's kind of interesting. Along that same line of thought, somebody went so far, like there was a school flyer that said, be sure to practice a sane Halloween, which I thought was very interesting. It's very specific wording that, I don't know why it brings to mind like Arkham Asylum from Batman. Like some extreme stuff was going on apparently.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the origin of Trick or Treat, and it ties in with the idea of the Spirit Veil because, the proverbial fairies, if you will, started to go way too far and really screw up some stuff.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I do remember a lot of pranks and fun times being had, and I do also remember times of violence and mischief that did go way too far. And then, of course, you have the urban legends that would follow through, some of the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, and, talks of Satanism and cultic practices and all this kind of stuff.
Oh my gosh. I was reading some of the tracts, if you will, talking about Halloween, and it was talking about how the Druids would go knocking from castle door to find virgin princesses to sacrifice to the devil. And
and you're talking about like the little evangelistic tracts of paper or comics that were passed out to scare people into heaven almost.
First off, as we've already discussed, they didn't really worship a devil. They were more dealing with goblins and fairies and elves than anything else. But, those tracts tried to say this is where dressing up in costumes comes from.
Right.
So don't go door to door in costume. But we talked about mumming in our masks episode where you would go door to door in costume. But the actual tradition of Halloween costumes is closer tied to like the 1920s costume balls, which were for adults, not kids, as they would dress up and, go party. So very interesting.
Yeah, so much, over the years, scare tactics to innocent pranks and religion getting involved, and then politics, and now retail and consumerism, and it's just a big muddled mess. But hopefully we've unraveled some of that for you in the past few weeks and taken you a little bit into history and shared with you some insights from various traditions and cultures around the world. Even tonight, kind of breaking down that veil a little bit and getting in touch with the other side.
One person again.
Yeah, I'm getting deep again. One person I read, and I don't remember where it was, described this, when people will become closer to the inner workings of our humanity. And I believe she even spoke about, connecting with the divine through all of this thinning of the veil. It's a little bit like pulling heaven down to earth. And with all the trickery and all the fun, I do think there's room for a little bit of that. We can practice love. We can practice kindness. Even internally, we can practice meditation and quietness in our own life to bring us in touch with the things that we need to be in touch with and bring a little bit of heaven into earth.
At the beginning of this series, we had talked about how part of the fascinating and exciting thing about Halloween is that community gets together. And you can, there are the scares of, always check the candy for drops of poison and crazy stuff. But, I never really saw any of that as a kid. It was always going up to a complete stranger's house and being surprised as they smile and just give you free candy.
Yeah.
And it was very nice to see. And it's still very cool to see people get out and do that and have bonfire parties in the front yard with total strangers.
Yeah, or even just like we have done for many years. We get together with family or friends, just like from your gaming group, and we all dress up together and go trick-or-treating and have a Halloween party. Or we go to a convention and hang around with, a couple thousand people and, just goof off. I think it is a lot about family and fun and community, and I do hope everyone listening is looking forward to that time of year where we can cool off a little bit, jump back into some fun traditions and be silly again and play, and at the same time remember where it all started, what it all really means, and how that applies to our life today at some level. In the meantime, hang out with us on Twitter. Share with us some photos on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. You can find us really easy in those places. Just look up the Monster Guys, and we'll be there. You can always contact us through themonsterguys.com as well. Thank you so much to Richard Martin, the Fear Merchant. Go check him out, thefearmerchant.com. Icy Sedgwick. Her website is icysedgwick.com. And Matthew Meyer, you can find him at yokai.com. Check those places out. Get a hold of their books. Icy and Matthew both have authored a number of works. Richard's podcast is a bi-weekly podcast where he talks to people from a wide spectrum of arts and disciplines, filmmakers, artists, authors, illustrators. It's just been a real joy to have these guests with us this month. And of course, like I said in the very beginning, this is about you. Those of you who are hanging out with us each and every week, listening and sharing your tidbits and your photos and your stories. We really appreciate it. Thanks for hanging out with us. It means a lot. As we have permission, we'll share with you stories and photos and experiences that you're sharing with this community. Look forward to some cool stuff next month. We've got a few things on the burner. Michael, we may take a little short break in September because we've got a couple of big announcements in October that we'll roll out with. That I don't know if I want to speak too soon on this, but could possibly be the Monster Guys 2.0.
Could very well be.
Could very well be with the things that are coming down the way. So, but in the meantime, folks, get your costumes ready now. Make those suckers elaborate. Go ahead and start buying your candy. The stuff is in the store. Do it up big time. Send us your photos. Share with us your stories. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much. Happy Halloween in July, everyone. Good night.
Happy Halloween in July, guys. Good night.